talk about what I read in the month of October. I set myself lofty goals in October that I came nowhere close to meeting, but I definitely did get quite a few things read, so let's just get into that. The first book I want to talk about is Velocity by Dean Koontz. This book was about a bartender who gets left a note where he has to choose between who dies. I believe it's an old woman or a young school teacher. If he goes to the police with the note, the old woman will die. If he doesn't show the police the note, then the school teacher will die. He believes it's all some sort of prank, so he does nothing and the school teacher dies. And then another note shows up. I really thought I was going to like this book. I'd never read anything from Dean Koontz, and I thought for sure that this was going to be something that I really enjoyed because I enjoy thrillers, and this seemed like it would be really fast-paced, and I enjoy that, like, moral conundrum of not knowing what to do, and I've seen this done a couple times in TV shows, and I've always really liked it. But I just didn't enjoy this. I found it very run-of-the-mill, very boring. The main character had nothing really to make me care about him. I think the writer did an okay job of coming up with reasons why the main character couldn't go to the police. It was only semi-believable, but it still, some of the shit made sense. It felt like most of the book was kind of about the lengths that men will go to save their own asses. The female characters in this book were astonishingly bad. There's only two, really. One was this waitress that the main character worked with at the bar, and basically her only characteristic seemed to be her sexiness. Like, he just kept going on about her innocence and her beauty and how that schoolgirl innocence made her even more sexy, and I was just like, okay, great. She wasn't there for much beyond that, and like, you only saw her twice, and each time was him talking about her sexiness and all the sexiosity. And then the other female character was in a coma. So she didn't really get to have a personality at all, other than to drive the main character to do anything. Like, his actions were all because of her, but she's in a coma. Like, so that was really frustrating as well. The ending was fine. I liked it enough. It very much reminded me of like a Criminal Minds episode, which was fine, but like, it was a bad episode of Criminal Minds. It was also incredibly annoying the amount of time I heard the word freak, because he refused to call him anything other than that. So anytime he wanted to talk about the villain in this, he would just continuously call him the freak, and it was so annoying. Every time he said it, it took me out of the book entirely. The other thing that bugged me is they treated kink like filth. Like, if you're into any sort of kinky shit, then you're like a degenerate, which, what year is this? I gave this 2 stars. I really just didn't enjoy it. The next thing I want to talk about is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. This is about a family whose oldest daughter starts to have mental health problems, and the family starts to believe that she's possessed, and they end up getting a film crew to document it, as well as a priest to perform an exorcism. This takes place from the younger sister's point of view, and it goes back and forth between the present and the past. It spends most of the time in the past, so when the main character is only like 5 years old or something, or maybe she's 8, I can't remember. But the older sister who's going through this is about 14, 15. I wanted to like this more than I did. I love The Exorcist. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time, so I will pretty much watch or read anything that has to do with exorcism, but this just didn't hit the mark for me. I heard so many people say it was creepy and scary, and it's just not. There was maybe 1 or 2 scenes that were actually creepy, but honestly, there wasn't that much there. And I don't even think the author meant for it to be scary, because there just weren't that many scenes that felt scary or horror-y. One of my biggest problems with this book is that every once in a while there would be a section from a blogger who was kind of recapping the scenes of this documentary show, and it was just so annoying to read. First of all, it was just over the top and cringy, but also it was basically spelling out the themes of the books for you and telling you how to feel. Like, it felt like Paul Tremblay like wanted to review his own book and dissect it, and so he did it in this blogger thing and included it in the book, and I just did not appreciate it. Things are also revealed very strangely. Like, it would be big moments, big things that I'm assuming are supposed to be twists, but they would just like drop them in the middle of like a nonchalant sentence, and I was like, okay. The ending was really good, but I just didn't love this as much as I wanted to, and I ended up giving it 3 stars. You can clearly tell Paul Tremblay is a good writer. This story just didn't work for me. Another thing I read in October was Into the Drowning Deep by Mira. This book was about killer mermaids. The main character is a girl whose older sister went on an expedition to find mermaids years ago and never came back. The entire crew died, and there was some mysterious footage that kind of showed that mermaids might have been alive. Or that mermaids might be real and were the things that killed them. So this is years later, and this company decides to send out another expedition crew to get better footage that proves mermaids are real, because everybody believes that this was some elaborate hoax. So the younger sister ends up on this crew along with a bunch of other characters. I loved so much of the setup for this book. I would say the first 40% of this book, I was so in. I was so excited, and I was just like completely entranced by this book. And then I got so bored. Like, I remember people saying that it took a while to get going, but it kind of doesn't. The first death happens at like 30%, so I was really happy about that, and the scene with the first death just like scared the absolute shit out of me. So I loved that, and I was like, I'm gonna love this book. And unfortunately, it kind of just all went downhill for me from there. I will say there's a lot of representation in this book. There's deaf rep and LGBTQ plus rep. There's autistic rep. And it feels like it's all really well researched. I obviously can't speak to a lot of those things. It definitely does a good job of showing the daily mistreatment that people with disabilities get. One of the problems with the book was I felt like almost all of the characters were very unlikable, and not necessarily in interesting ways. So I always find that annoying. I mean, the main character herself is likable, her best friend's likable, and her love interest is likable. But there are a ton of point of views in this book. And besides those 3 characters, a lot of them aren't that enjoyable to be around. And I think that's where a lot of my problem comes in, is the amount of point of views. At first, I appreciated the amount of point of views because it really like built out the world of this ship. But then it started really getting on my nerves, because every time I would switch a point of view, it would go through that character's inner monologue, and the inner monologue would be the exact same as the person before them. Because yeah, the mermaids are coming, yeah, the mermaids are scary, oh my god, I might die. And like, it kept going on each character in that sort of way, where they were all thinking these same things. But like, I don't need to read that 100 times. I thought the science of the ship was really well established, although went on a little bit too long, pretty much always. I didn't care about the ending. Like, I found some people were just like, oh my god, and that ending, and I was just like, okay. It just like really underwhelmed me. I enjoyed that all of the women in this were pretty badass, and I enjoyed the friendship dynamic between the main character and her best friend Louie, because it felt very subtle. Sometimes with best friend characters in books, I find they really overdo it and like really try to sell you that, yes, they're best friends, see, like secret handshakes and I don't know, whatever. But this felt like a subtle, natural friendship, and I appreciated that. Overall, I gave this book a 3.5. I really liked so much of it, but then so much of it irritated me. If it had been like 100 pages shorter, I think I would have liked it a lot more. Another book I read in October is Your Life is Mine by Nathan Ripley. This book is about a documentarian whose dad once murdered a bunch of people in a mass shooting in a shopping mall. And he also was running this sort of cult. Years after, her mom ends up murdered, and the main character believes that this cult is behind it and is still running. I found this book really addicting. I really enjoyed so much of it. Like, this is a book that's right up my alley because I very much enjoy slow-paced sort of thrillers, and that's definitely what this was. It was very slow-paced, but very addicting. This writer gives a lot of little details that really flesh out the characters. There was a chapter from the mother's point of view that I also like really enjoyed, because you really got a sense of just how deep her faith to her husband and this cult went. The lead character in this really reminded me of the lead character in Dark Places, which is one of my favorite books of all time, so I enjoyed that. To To me, this is a main character who is not the most likable, but is interesting enough that I want to spend time around her. I will say the ending is pretty anticlimactic. Like, it happens very quickly and it's over very quickly, which is not my favorite, but I still really just enjoyed my time reading it, even if I don't think it's the best book ever. And I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read in October is An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. I feel like this book is kind of hard to explain, but there's magicians and there's a bunch of magic houses. They all draw their magic from this one house, where anyone who's from this house and is having their magic leaked out of them for the rest of the world, they never leave that house. Except for the main character, who is one of only 2 people who are ever able to escape this house. And she's decided to get revenge on a lot of people. She gets hired by someone to take part in the Turning, which is this, I think it happens once every like 10 years or something, and it basically is a competition that re-ranks all the houses. This might be my favorite book I read in October, and I really wasn't expecting to love it because I'm not someone who reads fantasy stuff. But there was just something about this that I absolutely adored. And honestly, it has a lot of problems, but it didn't matter because I was just addicted to it. The way things are written in this book are so flowery and confusing. Like, I would be 100 pages in with things that they were talking about lots throughout it, but like I wouldn't understand it until all of a sudden it would click and I'm like, holy crap, there was 100 ways that you could have explained that better. But just because of the flowery way that she went about things, it made things more confusing than they had to be. Because of course you have to set up how this world works, and that's pretty important to get done right. And I will say she doesn't do a very good job, but eventually I got it and I loved it. She really liked similes, and she kept comparing things that didn't quite make sense. I remember her saying something about how the girl wore a dress as tight as smoke, and I was like, that, what? And then something about friends being as close as secrets or something, and I was like, those don't make sense. But like, I guess they sound good, and that's why she went for them. This was a book, I will say, that I think did really well with lots of perspectives, because even though it's from this one main character, my camera died, but hopefully everything looks marginally the same. So I was talking about An Unkindness of Magicians. I feel like this book is one of the few that does really well with multiple point of views. I feel like each character's point of view added something to the story. It made me understand their characters' motivations and actions better, and it told me more about the world around them. One of the best things about this book and this world was the houses that these people live in that are very much like alive and that kind of represent the person who owns the house. I thought that was really cool, and I wish that that had been explored more because it was such an interesting dynamic. I will say that the pacing was very, very strange. It kept building to these big moments where they would talk about how huge this duel was going to be, or how big this confrontation was going to be. And then it would just be over like that, and it was no big deal whatsoever. The other thing that I found kind of annoying was that the main character is a badass, which is great, but she is so badass that she is so clearly just miles above the rest of the people in this book that there's no one there who can really cause any sort of a threat to her. Like, you know she's gonna win everything that she walked into because of how good she is. So every duel she goes into, she just like kicks ass, takes names, and does it all and like without breaking a sweat. So it definitely felt like there were no real stakes. I know it sounds like I'm complaining a lot about the book, but I truly did love it because it was just such a good premise, and I enjoyed so many of the characters so much that despite all of its flaws, I will definitely be picking this book up for my bookshelves and reading it again. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next thing I read was Feast of Sparks by Sierra Simone. So this is a sequel to A Lesson in Thorns. It is a smutty book that has 6 important characters. They're all about a group of friends who come back to this place called Thornchapel that has sort of a mystical way about it, and there's rituals and orgies and just all sorts of fun things. I know that this book was super controversial. Everyone hated it pretty much. I loved it. I know so many people hated it, and I don't really get why. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'll get to the ending, but the first half of this book, I was just so enamored with it. It's, first of all, I will say the first 50% is almost entirely sex scenes. Like, just smut here, smut there, smut everywhere. It's amazing. They are some of my favorite smut scenes, and I just love them. But the main thing that made me love this book was the history that we got between Auden and Saint. I just fell in love with them as a couple. One of the things that bugged me about the first book was how much Saint and Poe loved Auden, because to me he was just such a boring character. I didn't get anything from him. I don't know why they were attracted to him in any way, but in this second book, seeing his history with Saint made me fall in love with him so much. Like, Auden might be my favorite character now. Well, maybe. I really do love Saint as well. But I just fell in love with Auden and their dynamic and their flirty, like, back and forth. And kind of the juxtaposition between, like, Auden being this true romantic and also being this dominant sexually. Them as a couple is just the best. Though I do have to say that these are male-male scenes written by a female author, so of course that's always iffy. Once you get past 50% is where the book kind of stumbled for me a bit. There's like all these sex scenes, and then there's the ritual, and then there's this chunk in between that is just them all talking about the ritual that's going to come. And they talking about the meaning of it, and talking about the past and the history of the ritual, and I was just so bored. It's one thing to talk about lore and to like kind of explain why this matters, but it was them like arguing about it because they don't have any specific book that tells them exactly what happened and exactly for what reason and all that. So it's just them like kind of debating what it could all mean, and it was just so annoying, and I did not care in the least. It just dragged. And then we got to the ritual, and I feel kind of let down in a way, I will say, by the ritual scene, because I wanted to love it so much, and I feel like I could have loved it so much. The character talks about how it goes by like a blur, and I feel like the author does a really good job of writing it that way, of making you feel like it's going by in a blur. But I'm a nosy bitch, and I wanted the goddamn details. Like, if she had written this in the same way she wrote all of her other sex scenes, with all the details, I would have died. Like, this would have been my favorite sex scene in the history of the world, because it was just 6 hot characters going at it in an orgy. Like, it could have been so good, and it was still good, but it wasn't the greatness that it could have been. And now we should talk about that terrible ending. Here's my thing with the ending. I don't like cheap gimmicks, and that's definitely what this was. Any twist that's there for shock value, any twist that's there and is going to be changed later on, which I'm sure this is, then I'm just like not here for it. It's a cheap shot, and I hate it. But that just didn't make me hate the rest of the book. I wish that it wasn't there. I wish that it didn't have to be talked about or explored in the next one. I know that it's just gonna be there for confrontation and for complication to keep these two apart even longer, but like, I'm not interested in that in the least, so that's really annoying. But I'm still gonna read the books. I'm still excited about them because I really do love this story. And I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It would have been a full 5 out of 5 because I loved that first half even more than the first book, but they really tripped up in the second half of the book. The last book I read, and then I'll get into the comics that I read, the last book I read was American Gods by Neil Gaiman. I hated this. This has been the bane of my existence since February. It took me so goddamn long to finish this book. I dragged my ass through it. Also, this isn't the version I read it online, so it had an extra 150 pages because it was the 10th anniversary edition, so fucking kill me. It was so bad. I don't understand why people like this book, like truly. There's nothing there. To say what this is about is to lie to you. Because, I mean, they say that it's about a bunch of gods who are, like, dueling, and the guy who's kind of caught being a lackey for one of them. But so the main guy in this Shadow, he's boring as hell. He has no emotions, he has no feelings about anything. He's just there as a conduit for, like, this weird journey that goes nowhere. It's really just 700 pages of this guy traveling all over the place and having conversations with different people. And the conversations are boring. I don't know what else to say about it. I truly did not like a single thing in this book. I finished it, so that was something. I gave it 1.5 stars. I don't even know why I gave it a half, mostly out of, like, fear of people coming at me with pitchforks, because some people just absolutely love Neil Gaiman, and I don't get it. Now onto the comic books I read this month. The first thing I read was The Woods. I only read volume 1 to this, and this was basically about a group of kids who go into the woods, and all of a sudden, like, their entire school or something is transported to this other place, other dimension, other planet, I don't really know. All of a sudden, like, shit kind of breaks down, and there's a power struggle within the school, and there's a bunch of kids who go off and try and figure out what's going on. I don't know. I did not like it. I DNF'd it after the first volume. It just felt very juvenile. The writing wasn't very good. It felt like something that I would have written in high school. All the adults were just, like, idiotic villains. Like, none of them felt like real people, and it moved way too fast and didn't really want to spend time establishing characters. So I moved on from that one. The next comics that I picked up were Nailbiter. I fell in love with these comics. The first volume, I believe, was free to read on Comixology, and I became so addicted I ended up buying the rest of the series and reading it immediately. These are very Silence of the Lambs-esque. There's a cop who is investigating the disappearance of a friend, and he ends up having to investigate this town where 16 serial killers are born. And no one knows, like, why this town, why are 16 serial killers from this area specifically. And anyways, he ends up kind of working with this one serial killer who, I believe he's, like, the most recent serial killer, and his name is Nailbiter. The biggest thing about this series is that they're just so addicting. They're just a really fun mystery, and I will say there are some problems. There was one issue that was goddamn terrible because the writer inserted himself into it, which was strange. Another one of the problems that I found in this was that the main character was a man of color, which was great, but he sometimes didn't feel like the main character. Like, he just felt so underdeveloped compared to the other cop that he was working with, who was the ex-girlfriend of Nailbiter, who was just a lot more developed than his character. I will say that I felt like there was no way the ending was going to be satisfying because of everything that was going on. It just felt like a big, all-encompassing thing. There was 2 mysteries going throughout the series, which was who had started up killing again, and 2, why did this town create so many serial killers? And because of what a big, crazy mystery that is, I felt like there was going to be no satisfying answer, whereas I actually ended up really liking the answer, and I was pretty satisfied. The answer to the first mystery, not so much of, like, who was currently killing, it was eh. But the second answer, for sure, I really, really liked. And I really just liked what it had to say overall, the series. And it's impossible to dislike Nailbiter, which I feel like that happens a lot of times in these types of stories. You end up liking the villain. And sure enough, I did. And the series itself made you kind of question why you liked him, which was cool. I gave the series 4 out of 5 stars. The next comic book series I read was Wytches. I wasn't a fan of this. It just didn't really work for me. It basically had to do with some witches who would drag people out into the woods and trap them in trees, kind of. I don't know. It was very strange, very, like, psychedelic almost. I don't know how to, disorienting. But for me, it just wasn't doing anything, and I did read through the whole thing, and it was fine. but I just didn't love it. I gave it 2 stars. The next thing I picked up was Nancy Drew, Volume 1. I liked it. The only problem I have with it is it did feel very juvenile. It felt like it was written for like 12-year-olds. Like it felt Scooby-Doo-ish, but then there was a lot of murder and drugs and like kind of big things. So it felt like the mysteries were like from Veronica Mars, but yet it was written for fans of Scooby-Doo. So that felt like a tonal mismatch. But I did really like the characters, and if they come out with more, I'd read them again, but I'm kind of thinking that they're not, because this was written like last year and nothing's been written since, so that kind of sucks. Oh, I gave Nancy Drew 4 to 5 stars. Outcast is about a guy who people in his life have been possessed, and he has been able to exorcise them, I think. This was fine. I honestly don't have much to say about it. I read Volume 1, I gave it 3 stars. I don't know if I'd read more. It's written by the same guy, Robert Kirkman, who wrote The Walking Dead, and I really did enjoy The Walking Dead comics. But I just wasn't immediately grabbed by Outcast, and there are just so many comics I want to read that I think this one will sit on the back burner. And then I picked up Locke Key. This was my favorite thing, by far, that I read this month. I loved it so much. This is about a family where the dad gets murdered, and these kids and the mom all move to the dad's family home. I can't remember where. I want to say Ohio or something. Maybe Indiana. I don't know. But they all move up to this place called the Key House, and this place has a lot of secrets. And they all have to do with keys, and there are ghosts, and it's so much I can't even explain. But it was incredible. I got so addicted. I read the entire thing, and it's getting turned into a show soon. I'm so excited. I don't know how it's going to translate to screen because there's just so much craziness that goes on, and it's so mystical, and everything in it is just so cool. It's dark. It's so original and so creative. I will say that some of the keys like kind of lead to almost a loophole situation because they can do anything because of these keys. But still, it was so cool. And I didn't love the ending as much because I feel like I don't love when they can kind of skate their way out of situations that they've written themselves into. Can't really explain that, but that part wasn't my favorite, but I almost cried. And it was a comic book, and I loved it, and I really can't sing its praises enough. It's affecting, for sure. And I loved every single character in it. So those are all the things I read in October. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back and watch more. Bye.